Restoring a vehicle. Done right, it can be one of the most rewarding things you can ever undertake. Done wrong, it can turn your life upside down. Shake the money out of your pockets and squeeze the sanity from your brain. Stacey David's Restoration Series is here to help you do it right. So you can keep your money and your sanity. And enjoy the fruits of your labor. So grab a wrench and let's get cranking. Stacey David's Restoration Series is brought to you by LMC Truck. Keep them on the road. And Cornwell Tools, the choice of professionals.
You know, when it comes to building or restoring a car or truck project, there are a lot of things that can fight for your attention, like the engine and the drivetrain or the body or the interior or the suspension. And the more advanced the project is, the more time-consuming all this stuff can become. But there is one thing that has to be done on any project, whether it's a simple level 1 project or a more advanced level 5 project. And it's got to be safe if you plan on driving the vehicle down the road. And I'm talking about the brake system. Now, the good news is there's really only two types of brake systems, disc brakes and drum brakes. But there's a lot of variables when it comes to setting up those systems and getting them to work right. So we're going to deal with all that, and we're also going to go through a lot of the questions and misconceptions that people have about setting up a brake system. So let's get to it. Okay, the first thing we need to do is make sure everybody has a good understanding of how the two brake systems work. When you push the pedal, it actuates the master cylinder that pushes fluid through the brake lines down to the wheels. On drum brakes, the fluid enters the slave cylinder, forcing it to expand, and that pushes the two shoes out until they contact the spinning drum. This stops the wheels from spinning. On disc brakes, the fluid enters the brake caliper and forces pistons to push the brake pads against the spinning rotor. This stops the wheels from spinning. Now, of the two systems, disc brakes are usually the most desirable because they are easier to service, they cool better, and they just supply better clamping force than a drum system. But that doesn't mean converting to discs all the way around is the best choice for you. Now, that depends on how you plan on using the vehicle. If you're going to just drive the vehicle around normally and enjoy it, keeping and rebuilding the original brake system is the simplest and cheapest way to go, especially if your project is 1960 or newer. Now, there's a chance that you may be able to find some of these brake parts at the local auto parts store, but your best bet is to find a company that specializes in your vehicle and get all the new parts there. For example, we completely rebuilt the brake system on this '78 Bronco using parts from LMC Truck. We also did the same thing on this '86 Chevy with all new front calipers and rotors, new shoes, drums, and hardware for the rear, and we also replaced the brake lines and hoses and the master cylinder and the proportioning valve. You'd have a hard time finding all these parts at the local auto parts store. But even though the original brake parts might be available, that may not be the best choice. Because if you're planning on doing any performance driving at all, whether off-road or on-road, well, you're probably going to want to upgrade the brakes to handle that. One option is to add disc brakes to the front and keep the original drums in the rear. This will give you great brakes at a moderate price. Or you can just put disc brakes all the way around and have awesome brakes. But whichever way you go, there's more to this than just bolting some brakes onto a vehicle. There are some other things that you have got to upgrade. Let's take a look. Now, I know big brakes are really popular and people are slapping huge rotors and calipers on their projects. And while that may look cool, that doesn't necessarily give you the best brakes. Having a well-matched system does that. Okay, first is the master cylinder. And if you have an old single master cylinder like this, you need to just throw that in the trash, man, or hang it on the wall because that is not safe. What you need is a dual master cylinder like this that has a separate reservoir for the front and the rear brakes. This way, if you develop a leak in the system, you don't completely lose your brakes. That is why the OEMs did away with these decades ago. Now, if your vehicle came with drum brakes and you're going to upgrade to discs and you want to reuse the stock master cylinder, yeah, you need to think about that because it probably doesn't have the volume that you need, and there's a good chance it has residual valves in the outlets, none of which is compatible with disc brakes. What you need is a new dual master cylinder, like this one from Master Power Brakes. Now, don't let this single inlet fool you. This is actually a state-of-the-art dual master cylinder. Now, if you're going to run manual brakes, the bore of the master cylinder should be 1 inch or smaller. If you go any bigger than that, you're going to have a really hard pedal. If you're going to go with power brakes, the bore of the master cylinder should be greater than 1 inch, because with the assistance of the booster, you're going to have plenty of power for the bigger bore. All right, since we're on the subject, what about manual and power brakes? Which one should you use? Well, the good news is you can run drum brakes, you can run disc brakes, or a combination of the two as either manual or power brakes. But you need to make sure that your pedal ratio matches the bore of your master cylinder. As a general rule, the pedal ratio should be 6:1 for manual brakes with a 1 inch bore master cylinder and 4:1 for power brakes with a 1 1/8 inch bore master cylinder. A lot of brake pedals have 2 rod locations already on them. The top one for manual brakes and the lower one for power brakes. If yours doesn't have this, you're going to need to drill a hole in the proper location. And here's a formula to help you do that. Now, the most common way to add power to brakes is with a vacuum booster. And the only problem with these is that the stock ones are kind of big, cumbersome things that don't look very good. So, people tend to swap these out for these cool little street rod ones. The only problem here is this is one area where size really does matter. You really don't want to go smaller than an 8 inch booster on the typical car or truck. If you go too small with it, the brakes aren't going to work with a hoot, no matter how hard you push on the pedal. Now, another thing to remember, a booster takes 18 inches of vacuum to work properly. So, if you've built a big hot rod engine with a big lumpy cam and you don't have enough vacuum, you're going to want to add an electric vacuum pump so you can get enough vacuum to run your brakes. An alternative to the vacuum booster is the Hydro Boost that runs off the power steering pump. Now, these systems work extremely well, but they do require plumbing lines from the power steering pump. Okay, the next question is, should you reuse your original proportioning valve? And the answer, no. Because first of all, it's old. Second of all, it's not going to be compatible with the brakes that you're putting on. And if you spent hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars on new brakes, that is not the place to get cheap. If you want something that's going to be compatible with your new disc brake system and simple to install, you probably need something like this combination valve. Now, it has the brake pressure switch, the metering valve, and the proportioning valve all in one unit. Now, if you're into racing or want an adjustable proportioning valve, those are available too. All right, if you're running drum brakes, you're going to need a 10-pound residual valve in the brake line. Now, what this does is keeps just enough pressure in the line so the shoes don't retract all the way in when you get off the pedal. Instead, the shoes stay out nice and close to the drum. That way, when you hit the brakes again, you got a nice firm pedal. Now, if you're running disc brakes, you don't need a residual valve unless you're putting the master cylinder down on the frame where it's going to be lower than the calipers. If you do this, you're going to need a 2-pound residual valve in the brake line to keep the fluid from flowing back from the calipers into the master cylinder and giving you a spongy pedal when you first hit the brakes. Okay, the last part of upgrading any brake system are the brake lines and the brake hoses. And you got a couple choices here. First of all, you can go with the original style brake line that you can get at any auto parts store. And they use a 45-degree double flare. Notice how fat it is. And this uses a brass fitting to seal. And of course, all the fittings that it goes to are readily available at any auto parts store. Or you can go with a stainless steel line. Now notice this uses a 37-degree single flare, because if you try to double flare stainless steel, it's going to split on you. Then it uses this collar to help seal. And finally, you have an AN style fitting. So all of the fittings that go to that need to be AN style, which means you need to pick those up probably at a hot rod shop or online. Now, of the two, The stainless steel is the better looking. It lasts longer, but it's more expensive, harder to get fittings for. The original style, you can get it anywhere, and it's easy to service. The biggest thing, though, is you need to make sure and use the proper flaring tool. A 45-degree double flare for standard, and the 37-degree single flare for the stainless steel. And you can get these in separate kits, or you can get it in a master flaring kit so you can do both. For a single flare, bring the line flush with the tool edge, then flare it with the press. And that's all there is to it, a 37-degree single flare. For a double flare, extend the line beyond the clamp the proper distance, then make the first flare with a special jig. Follow it up with the final flare in the press, and you have a 45-degree double flare. The final pieces are the brake hoses. Now obviously the original rubber style hoses are available, and they're great for original brakes. But most aftermarket brakes come with braided stainless steel hoses, and those have AN style fittings on them. So you need to make sure that you have the proper adapters to hook those hoses either to AN fittings or standard fittings, depending on which brake line you're using. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff here. Obviously, there is a lot to setting up a brake system and getting it to work properly. That's why you want to use as many parts as you can from the same company so you know everything's going to be compatible. Now, hopefully we've answered some of the questions that you might have about setting up a brake system so you can do just that. Build the brake system that's going to work best for you and the way you're going to drive your vehicle. Because going fast is one thing. Stopping is the counterpoint to going fast. So get out there, build something cool, twist those wrenches, and we'll see you down the road.